How do you ride a half halt? During the transition, for example, you sit heavily in the saddle. How do you do that? How do you sit heavily in the saddle? I guess you weigh 50, maybe 52 kilo? No matter. Well, you can't get heavier. You have your weight. You can make yourself taller, yes. What happens oftentimes when you make yourself tall like this? What happens to the riders? You stiffen, they overstretch, and if I overstretch, I become stiff. What do you do during a half halt? How does it work? A half halt is ridden by, as Eckart Meyners says, by pulling your belly button in. What happens when I pull my belly button in? Look at me sitting here pulling my belly button. What happens? The weight balance shifts backwards. Yes, basically the hip tilts backwards, right, backwards like this, and the plate goes down in the back. So when I pull in my belly button, but that only works if my back isn't hollow. If riders sit with a hollow back like this, then pull in their belly button, nothing happens because the hip doesn't move. That is why the correct length of stirrups is so important, so that you have the optimal position for the hip. So when I pull in my belly button, my hip tilts backwards, and now pay attention to my hands and whatever happens when I pull in my belly button. They move back, but they move back reactively. So that means I don't move my hand or my arm back actively, not pulling in the belly button and thus tilting my hip backwards, but tilting the hip. The hands move reactively, and that's how it's supposed to be. You can't ride a downward transition if you don't get some pressure on the bit, more connection, more contact. And that only works if I get on the bit, but that has to happen reactively. It must not happen actively. That is the difference between riding backwards and correct half halts. And what you can't see when I pull in the belly button, that hip tilts. The posterior thigh muscle automatically contracts. That means that the horse or the rider closes his leg around the horse, and thus the horse is between all of the rider's aids, between what we call the weight aids, the leg aids, because the muscle contracts and the rein aids. The most significant point is that when I pull in my belly button, I can still move my hip freely and swing forwards and backwards. If I tell the rider now to make himself taller and sit against the rider, overstretches, the hip movement is immediately limited, and in that moment you are no longer able to adapt to your horse, and that is why there is always a resistance, more or less considerable, but never as harmonious cooperation. Exhaling is sufficient. When you breathe in, I think we talked about that yesterday, the diaphragm goes down. You know, did we talk about that yesterday or not? So, when I breathe in and out, that is done by my diaphragm. The lung itself isn't a muscle that contracts, but the diaphragm gets pulled down, and this causes a vacuum in the lung when I breathe. Thus the air streams into the lungs. So, when the diaphragm goes down, what happens then with your belly? It gets pushed back as well. When the diaphragm gets pushed down, it separates the area of the lungs and the heart from the guts. And if I now push my diaphragm down, my guts have to make room. So here I inhale. Where does my belly go? To the front. To the front. It protrudes because all of this has to go somewhere. When I exhale, the diaphragm pushes against the lungs. The oxygen leaves the lungs. Or rather, the air gets pushed out. And the belly button goes in. So basically, all I have to do is exhale correctly. Then the belly button goes in, and here, pay attention to the plate again. It lightly tilts backwards as well. And if your hip tilts backwards here, then your horse's hip tilts as well. And the horse's steps underneath the centre of gravity, and you can continue to move your hips smoothly and be moved by the horse. And that is what you try now. Yes, you ride in the trot as usual, and you shortly get him on the bit, and when you have that contact, you exhale and see if he makes the transition and how he does it. How is that for you? Pay attention to. And exhale. and again. It could be a tad more exact, I think. That was only a hint of exhalation. And do, super. And pick up the trot again and do it again at X. Or there on the short side. And how is that? Good. That comes almost automatically, doesn't it? Yes. And another transition. Exhale. Super. Did you feel that? Yes.
Yeah.
You can also play around with this a little and try to see what happens when you actively pull in your belly button. How the horse does the transition then. And then you do it again by exhaling. That works better for you than actively pulling it, doesn't it? Agreed? Now you have learned how to ride a half halt. Here, exhale with the sound of an F. And deliberately pay attention to what happens to your diaphragm in your belly. So these functional correlations are pretty important. That you know exactly what precisely you have to do, where do you have to actively contact muscles, and what happens as a reaction. And these biomechanical processes happening, you should be aware of them and know the basics.